Hi, everybody. We have a great show today. I'm really excited to talk to our guest. Her name is Nancy MacLean, and she wrote a very important book called Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. You know, the book came out in 2017. I thought it was scary then, but today it's more than scary. Today it feels prescient because it takes us back to the beginning of this theory, this economic theory, that property rights is absolute. Property rights are sacrosanct. And the realization or the belief on the part of many people, including the Koch brothers, that basically absolute property rights are at odds with democracy, and that in order for property rights to be protected and exalted, democracy itself must be kept in chains. Nancy MacLean is an award-winning scholar. She's the William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. Her research focuses on gender, race, labor history, and social movements in the United States in the 20th century, particularly focused on the U.S. South. She's received more than a dozen prizes and awards. She's a seminal thinker. And I think for those of us who are deeply curious, deeply concerned, and realize that the United States has become in very many ways disunited. For those of us who are looking for a deeper understanding, how did we get this way in order to understand what it is that we need to do to repair? I don't think anybody is more important to talk to than Nancy MacLean. Welcome. Nancy MacLean, thank you so much for being here. It's just an honor to speak with you.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
You know, I think many Americans realize that we are in trouble, that the United States has become disunited. I don't think that people are in denial about that, the way I think many people were in denial about the declining trajectory that got us here. Now that there is, I believe, a critical mass of people who realize we're in trouble, I think that there's a listening for a deeper analysis of how we got this way in order for us to have a sober appraisal of what's going to be necessary in order to repair. I can't think of any person or any book that has done more to lay out the path that took us here than yours and your book, Democracy in Chains. So I want to talk to you. You know, the book came out in 2017. When the book came out, I found it scary. It was chilling. Now it's even more chilling because it was so prescient. So I'd like two categories of conversation here. First, what was already in the book. How did all this start? What was the stealth plan? Mm-hmm. Why was there a strategy to, quote unquote, put democracy in chains? Who did it and why? And then after we've sort of laid that out, or you've laid that out, I want to know how you see things now, where we've gotten to since you wrote the book, and once again, your thoughts about how we can repair.
Wonderful. It sounds like a perfect agenda.
Great. How did all this start?
Well, I'm a historian, so I can keep going back if we wanted to. But interestingly, the ideas of the cause that I wrote about have a remarkable similarity to the ideas of the pro-slavery South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun in the 1830s, who came up with a whole analysis of American society that would defend absolute property rights and created many of the categories that are still in play by the libertarian movement today. But I won't take your readers' time up with all of that long story, but will just say that I picked up the thread in the late 1950s, in 1956, in Virginia, during the fight over Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of public schools. And I happened there in that research on an economist named James McGill Buchanan, who was the first U.S. winner of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences from the South. And he developed a very unusual school of thought that basically, he was really our most original thinker, some could argue, in the late 20th century about democracy. And the fact is, he was really against it. And so I picked up on that story and found that his ideas ended up being discovered and subsidized by Charles Koch, the multi-billionaire from Wichita, Kansas, CEO of Koch Industries, and the huge number of organizations that he and his fellow donors in the Koch donor network fund. And basically, what he found in Buchanan's ideas was something that he had been looking for since the 1960s and patronizing various intellectuals to try to get what he called a technology of change. And what he meant by that is that he knew the kind of libertarianism he sought, this extreme property rights absolutism, this deep anti-hostility to government, to any kind of regulation or social programs, that it was not going to fly politically in a democracy. You could never get people to vote for that kind of agenda. So you had to figure out another way of doing it. And basically, he found in the ideas of this political economist a strategy that could be weaponized and turned into a way of, as my book puts it, shackling democracy. And that is what we have seen with accelerating speed. It's been developing for a while. A lot of groundwork was laid in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s and the 1990s, but it really took off. We all became more aware that something was happening after the election of President Obama in 2008. And since then, this Koch-led cause has managed to capture control of 30 state governments through a Republican Party. It's radicalized beyond all recognition, to have increasing sway over our courts, as we see with the 6-3 majority for candidates from an organization that he funded, the Federalist Society, and in the almost catastrophic state of our national politics in Washington, D.C. So I know that's a lot to put out there, but I'm sure that you will also pull out the threads that will be of interest to listeners.
Well, there are some specific phrases that you used which do weave the story. And it begins with the absolutism of property rights. So when you talked about this Southern Senator Calhoun, when are we talking about?
So we're talking about the 1830s as the rising abolition movement was challenging the institution of human enslavement and saying it was at odds with the Declaration of Independence, that it was a sin and it had to go. And in that context, the most determined Southern slaveholders began constructing a defense of slavery, a defense that involved racialism, it involved biblical stuff, it involved what passed for science then. But the one who really had a strategy to protect planters' power was Calhoun, who rethought the U.S. Constitution in ways that are very similar to what today's corporate-funded libertarians are doing.
So on one hand, you had humanitarian and moral values and the basic construct of the Declaration of Independence, which is all men are created equal. That you have on one hand. On the other hand, you have the proponents of absolute property rights, and in their mind, slaves were property.
Yes.
And so, whereas the moral humanitarian democratic view was saying you were transgressing against the Declaration of Independence, Calhoun and others, slave owners, specifically, were arguing, no, the Declaration of Independence, as you interpret it, is transgressing against absolute property rights.
Absolutely.
So you're saying that this thread was then picked up by a Virginia economist that I think I read or heard you say had been educated at the University of Chicago?
Yes, absolutely.
Did I just make that up? Okay.
And teachers.
He basically picked that up and he argued or posited in a way that was then very attractive to the Koch brothers that actually free market, absolutism, and the exaltation of property rights as almost like some higher good, that sort of what I see as a kind of shadow side of capitalism, the kind of toxic brand of capitalism, is at odds with democracy, that it could only survive and maintain itself if democracy is kept in chains, That was the economic theory, and the Koch brothers came along and said, well, actually, we could fund the political strategy to bring that into being. Is that what you said?
That's exactly right. And I would add another thing, Marianne, which is that it's not coincidental, I think, that the Koch Industries is based in the fossil fuel sector. And James Buchanan's
Shocker.
early funders also came from Sun Oil and many of the other key,
Sure.
oil industries of the
Right.
time. So I think, another thing driving this is that by the 1990s, it was clear that the world was beginning to recognize global warming as it was called then global warming, today climate change, as a dire threat. And that was actors across the political spectrum. I think it's important to say, George Herbert Walker Bush made a major speech about this. Other actors around the world, other global leaders were starting to act on it, as we saw with the Kyoto protocols. And I think that scared the hell out of Charles Koch, along with others in that sector. And so it's very, it's not the same. Of course, this is not about slavery, but the logic of these absolute property rights that democracy must not be allowed to impinge upon, even if it's endangering the people and all the species of the world. It is that extreme in ideology and that toxic. So I really think about libertarianism now as a deadly dogma and something that people need to understand.
And the survival of the planet itself.
Yeah.
So, and as you said, Nixon, a Republican president, had established the EPA.
Yes.
So when Koch said he joined with this Buchanan economics, and he said, I can provide the political strategy, the political technology, as you said, establish the Federalist Society. What did they aim for first? The Republican Party?
Oh, interesting point. Well, this enterprise is there's a whole integrated strategy of multiple dimensions. So they continued to fund scholars and bases at campuses in the United States. Now their Koch money is going to over 300 campuses. The main base is at George Mason University, which I wrote about, but there are other scattered centers that provide the ideas that are used by this project, and they provide intellectual cover for it, because when a donor funds your position and you have a named chair at a good university, people think, well, they must know what they're talking about. So you have all of that, but they also funded think tanks of different kinds, as you mentioned, the Federalist Society. So a whole array of organizations. So the Republican Party became an early object of interest, with more and more money going in and strategies, again, to, in this case, in-chain Republicans. So we saw the phenomenon of primarying. That wasn't even a verb in our vocabulary 20 years ago, but we saw increasing numbers of Republican elected officials that they dubbed rhinos, Republicans in name only, when they were in fact the Republicans in name only. They would have used any party they could have, but they primaried any Republican who said that he would raise taxes, he or she would raise taxes, and any Republican who would take action on the climate. And so they kept narrowing down the basis of the Republican Party with the donor money, and then with feeding the Republican base a steady, stew of disinformation from Fox News and other outlets. So getting that control of the Republican Party was critical, but it was also supplemented by literally hundreds of other organizations that these donors fund.
Okay, now I want to slow down a little bit on that, because I think a lot of people are curious what happened to the old political parties that we used to know. When I grew up in a Democratic family, but there was a sense that there were some things on which we agreed to agree, no matter what political party we were in. And that's that the government had a role in maintaining a balance between individual liberty and a concern for the common good. So yes, individual liberty would include economic liberty, but not when that transgressed upon the obvious needs of the commons. Yes. Even Republicans, or at least we liked to think, recognize that. Now, you talk in your book about people like John Boehner, Orrin Hatch, Arlen Specter, who were the early targets of this destructive missile, attitudinal political missile that was thrown at any of the old-fashioned, what we now see as the old-fashioned Republicans, who, yes, they were certainly what we would see today as corporatists, but they were not insane, and they realized that there is such a thing as the common good. There is some place for public expenditure as well as privatization. Do you have anything you want to tell us about how all that went down?
Yeah.
When it went down, was the Tea Party? I
Hmm.
mean, I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, when did this all
I
happen? How
know,
did it
yeah, I know.
happen?
It's
So
almost
if you
like
give us a,
feel like we've been sort of sleepwalking and suddenly the world is
yeah, and I think now people get it, but we want to sort of connect the dots. And of course, that's what you do so
yeah,
beautifully.
I want to. I'm really glad that you raised that and reminded us of what the Republican Party used to be like. When I was a kid
Hmm.
in the 1970s, there were liberal Republicans. Because there
That's right.
was
Rockefeller and Weicker, Lloyd
exactly. I mean,
Weicker,
as
and they went and told, Howard Baker, and they went and told Nixon, "You've gone too far."
yes, and I will confess that when I guess I was middle school then, but I actually campaigned for Lowell Weicker. I was so
Well,
impressed.
I never went that far
Yeah,
yet.
I know, but I was so
That would have
impressed
been
with
my
the
life.
role
But
he
I
played.
know he was like a liberal. What was he, Connecticut?
Yeah, yeah.
Was Lowell Weicker?
Yeah, and
There
my
were
dad
liberal
voted
Republicans.
Republican, most of his life until his death in 2000. But he would not recognize this party. It has been
No,
so
no.
very transformed, and so I'm glad that you mentioned Orrin Hatch because I have that quote from him early in the book where he says, after he was primaried, he says words to the effect of. These people aren't Republicans. They're not conservatives. They're radical libertarians. I detest these
But
people.
you also mentioned in the book that he ultimately folded.
Absolutely. And he becomes the one who, having recognized that, then denies President Obama even a hearing for Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court seat. So he's actually a case study of how that donor influence could work with, again, a primary challenge to keep people in line. Now, I have to say for myself, I get the mechanisms that they use, but I'm kind of heartbroken and shocked as a citizen that there are almost no Republicans who have spoken out about this process or who are willing to risk their seats. With the exception now of Liz Cheney. Adam Kinzinger is not even going to run again. But our journalists need to be asking them, what did you see? Who did it, and when did you see it, and how does it work? And tell the country because we need to know this.
Well, that's what you've done. But talk to me for a minute about Mitch McConnell.
Mitch McConnell, is about power. And about holding power for himself and his party, with the kinds of sources that I have access to, I didn't have access to, say, Mitch McConnell's papers, right, or private records. But what I can say is that Charles Koch is an extremely smart manager. He has built Koch Industries from a relatively small company he inherited from his father into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, with operations in 6 countries and multiple billions in revenues. So he knows how to create incentives, to get people to do what he'd like them to do. And so what he has done, and the people informed by this thinking have done, that is sheer genius, if it's a genius that's very disturbing to those of us who believe in democracy, is to really assess the people that they have to use for this project and what incentives will move them. So for Mitch McConnell and for many Republican leaders, the idea of keeping their party in power forever, a kind of a third
Is
right
very
for
attractive.
Republicans, that's good enough for them. And maybe they don't even ask questions about the other things, but these donors gave them a strategy with voter suppression, extreme gerrymandering, and all the other things they're doing, gave them a strategy to hold on to power, even when the numbers wouldn't support that, against the numbers in many states, and as we see, with the Electoral College versus the popular vote. So that's McConnell. Another piece of this picture is the religious right. And there was a point at which, and I believe it was also in the late 1990s, but it's become ever more expanded now, where this network of donors realized that they weren't going to be able to break through by telling the people the truth about the kind of society that they wanted, but they had to get them to the polls anyway to make all these other things happen. And so they began to leverage what people now call culture war issues, right? The fear of particularly white evangelicals and some Catholics about abortion, about women's freedom, about homosexuality, the anxieties of native-born Americans about new immigrants in their communities, and good old-fashioned racism. And these operations do all of that, but I think the single most important contribution has come from the entrepreneurs of the religious right, who brought them whatever it is, 70, something like 70 million or 60 million voters, most of whom believe that the Bible is inherent truth, therefore suspect science, from the opening gate, and who have been listening to religious broadcasting for years, to Fox News, and have become the most loyal Republican voters and have proved the most loyal to Donald Trump since then, with, I believe it's 70% of Republicans now saying that Joe Biden didn't legitimately win the election.
Yeah.
So capturing that share of the electorate was absolutely crucial for this project.
Now, you say in the book that Koch was not interested in Donald Trump. Donald Trump was not his guy. What happened there? Where was Trump? Where were they? And how did they come together?
Yeah, I think one thing that is helpful for people to know is that the people who are the strategists here, and I'm particularly referring to Buchanan and Koch, but they don't actually care who's in office. What they want is to get their agenda, right? So it's a personality contest. It's like, get them all to buy into our agenda, and then the people can choose whatever face they want because they're going to carry out the same policy. So that's what they did with Marco Rubio, with Jeb Bush, with Chris, that whole crowd of Republican frontrunners. Donald Trump, because of his money and his media platform, was able to buck that, right? And we forget today because he said so many horrible things, but he also said, he was going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act and bring something better that would cover everyone so well. He said he was going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. He said he was going to end tax loopholes in business that people like him could exploit. So he said all these things that he had no interest in actually doing, but they made it easier for people to go on the on-ramp with him. Now, once Charles Koch did at one point in the election season call him a monster. So I should say that, but he's a monster that they very quickly tamed. Donald Trump didn't have space in the establishment. As soon as he came into office, it was like surround sound with people from the Koch network, most obviously Mike Pence, his vice president. And they got so much that they wanted from him. 3 Supreme Court justices appointed, that horrible tax bill that will hurt middle-class people, but was full of little tricks to make people not realize
crumbs to make people think they got something,
and many more things, as you know.
So once again, not to lose sight of the main storyline, all of this was in order to protect, extend, and maintain an economic philosophy of property rights absolutism, which by definition favors those who have property, right? Yeah. And the recognition that that is inherently at odds with democracy, because it is inherently at odds with a nation of the people. A nation of the people, by the people, for the people, must by definition transcend to a nation of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people, of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. So the Republicans had, before that time, certainly favored corporations, but not with a denial of the recognition of the basic tenets of democracy. When this shift occurred, it was a corporatist absolutism, which at that point recognized that democracy must be kept in chains. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Is it correct to say that the Democratic Party has become what the Republican Party used to be?
Oh, that's an interesting.
Because of the flood of money on the system, the Democrats now, no matter what they say, favor corporate interests in more policy positions than not. However, continue to recognize that there is a commons. That democracy does matter. They're trying to play it both ways, which does little more than make them appear disingenuous to people. With that?
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I do remember Bill Clinton, who really, played a pivotal role in transforming the Democratic Party in this, the direction you're describing. He once said that he was really an Eisenhower Republican, and with reference
And he
course,
was.
to the president in the 1950s, who it called himself a modern Republican, accepted the New Deal as a fait accompli. As you said, recognized the need for a common good, for some regulation, even though was more pro corporate rights and power than the Democrats of the time. I would say I think there's really a fight on for the soul of the Democratic Party at this
Yes,
point.
correct.
I
I certainly
we're
agree with
part
you
of that.
because it's not the total. Yeah,
Yeah.
so because it's not the total fait accompli
Yes.
in the Democrats. With the Republicans, it's a fait accompli. They've won. The only people left are Liz Cheney and Adam
Mhm.
Kinzinger. And like you said, Adam Kinzinger isn't even going to run
Mhm.
again. Although I think we'll see. We'll see more of him.
Yeah.
With the Democrats, the fight is
Yeah,
on.
and
The
the other
war is
thing I
raging.
think about the Democrats that's important to know is, they may not be pushing as hard as many of us would like them to defend workers' rights, and to enable workers to have collective voice, or to support Black freedom, or women's reproductive rights. But at least they're on board for those, right? And there's not a single Democrat
Well,
I know of who's against who supports voter suppression. So and now I think gerrymandering is a place where the corporate interests that you talk about come in, because it's the combination of dark money in politics and big money in politics and gerrymandering that really kind of buys off a large section of Democratic leadership, as you're suggesting. So I think, if we want to see things change, we have to support the change makers, who are fighting for the soul of the party. But we also
yeah.
have to have serious structural democracy reform to limit money in politics, and a national standard that's against gerrymandering. Because there are plenty of old Democrats who sit in perfectly safe seats with no competition, like Republicans, and citizens don't like it. Actually, herpes polls better than gerrymandering. So
Yeah, well, I think that that's where you and I might you have a little more charitable view of all that than I do, because if you do not support getting rid of the filibuster,
mhm.
you said you don't know one Democrat who supports voter suppression, but if you don't support getting rid of the filibuster, then you are not supporting the only way to actually get rid of the voter suppression at this point.
That I think that's
So
an important
that's
point, but I think it's also important for us to realize that when, FDR, when first of all, when the radical Republicans, enacted Reconstruction, when FDR, put through the New Deal, when Lyndon Johnson, helped get through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and the War on Poverty, they had huge margins to work with. They could lose 10 or a dozen Democrats and still, or Republicans in the case of Reconstruction, they could lose a lot of voters in Congress of their votes and still get legislation through. The problem of the Biden administration now, which actually is listening to the left more than the Obama administration did or any previous ones, but the problem is it's so tight. It's 50-50. And so we have Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kristen Sinema from Arizona who have blocked all that. I mean, I could be wrong. I think most Democrats would not, or they couldn't have gotten. If Manchin and Sinema had supported anything, and you had all Democrats voting together, I don't think that they would have completely eliminated the filibuster, but I think they would have gone back to a talking filibuster, which would have made Republicans have to stand up there for hundreds of hours before citizens, stopping people from getting voting rights. So. It's a really difficult moment. I think they also
Yeah,
overpromised and outdelivered.
yeah. No, I think that there are two significant issues there. Number one, the Democratic leadership, which is basically the Eisenhower Republican brand of the Democratic Party, has been consistently supporting the Eisenhower Republican brand of Democrats
Mhm.
and suppressing the progressive brand of Democrats. And many people believe that the margins would not be so tight
Mhm.
if the Democrats had not wandered so far from their core, theoretically, what had been their core principles, which is an unequivocal stand for the working people of the United States.
Yeah, I'm fine.
So
I'm with you on that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
yeah, okay.
and the
That's number
South,
one. And
I
number
say,
two,
there's a great piece of research done by an economic historian that showed that, contrary to the myth, which I myself, spread in lectures because that's the way the history was taught, but that the Democrats lost the South after Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. That actually wasn't true, particularly for state level politics. It was only after Clinton signed NAFTA and there was a hemorrhaging of manufacturing
Thank
from the
you.
South.
Thank you. And also, let's remember Johnson's words. We just lost the South for a generation. He didn't say we just lost the South for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
He said we just lost the South for a
Yeah.
generation. And the Democratic Party in many ways abandoned the South, including abandoning the rights of the workers in the South. Once you start withdrawing your unequivocal support for the workers, that means for the majority of the people in the South as well as everywhere else. So,
Yes, I completely agree with you. And
yeah.
the National Democratic Party also didn't pay attention to the states. You know, they treated people in states like my North
No.
Carolina as like
Well,
ATMs for national races. And now we're bearing the fruits of that because they lost control of so many states. And with the Republicans, these radicalized Republicans in power, they have rigged the rules so that they can preside no matter what happens. So my state, North Carolina, the maps the Republicans drew this cycle, we're a 50-50 state, slightly more Democratic voters. They claim their maps would ensure them 10 seats, congressional seats, to Democrats 4 in a 50-50 state. So that's how much having control of state governments makes a difference.
You know, Nancy, I think it's so interesting. The Republicans, in all the ways that you have mentioned, stand for the most elitist policies, but have, in some really ironic way, a more egalitarian relationship to their own constituency. The Democrats historically stand for the opposite. They still would stand for the more egalitarian policies, but a more elitist relationship to its own constituency, which includes the almost looking at the leadership, almost looking down their noses at so much of the progressive base, which actually represents the core values traditionally of the Democratic Party. I also think that we shouldn't forget how much the president could do with executive orders if he chose to. The president has chosen not to cancel the college loan debt. The president has chosen not to declare a national medical emergency and expand Medicare. The president has chosen not to for instance, declassify marijuana as a Schedule I drug. So we talk about, he has such a thin margin. But in fact, there is so much that he could do that could guarantee the kind of excitement that would at least give us a running chance in the midterms. And that one can only suppose, because of his own obeisance to the corporatist interests in the Democratic Party, has refused to do.
Yeah, in some ways, I think Biden also just lives in another world, that he cannot.
He lives in
He
another
remembers
world.
when he had Republican friends and
That's
they would do
right.
things. So
That's
time has
right.
been wasted trying to win over
Yeah.
people that would never be won over. And that's a lesson we should have learned in the Obama years and Obama regretted it, spending so much time with Susan Collins, who basically wasted his time and dragged things out. And we don't have time to waste at this point. So I agree.
Well,
Also, we need messaging that conveys to people the scale of the emergency. And it is interesting. Like, I've learned this from some very sophisticated pollsters. Sadly, it doesn't do much for the majority of American people to say we may be losing our democracy, because people are so preoccupied right now with COVID, with how are they going to pay the bills, with what's going to happen to their parents or their kids or whatever. So I think we need to also remind people that democracy is how we get the things they need, right? And so if we've got to repair that bridge so that people understand that what's really at stake now is that we are up against a cause that wants to make it so that they can privatize Medicare, and Social Security, and you won't have anything to say about it. They can privatize public education, and you won't have anything to say about it. They can end your right to have collective voice in the workplace or reproductive rights or any of these things, and rig the system so much that we can't change that. And that's the piece I think people need to understand, that it's not democracy in the abstract, as you've well pointed out. Our democracy is deeply flawed. So we have to protect this thing that's flawed so that we can renew it so that it can meet the challenges of our time.
I think it's gone too far. And I think so much of what the president is doing now is too little, too slow, and too late. And this idea that all we need is better messaging.
No, that's
No, what we need is action, and action of the kind that I mentioned, whether it has to do with universal health care, whether it has to do with canceling the college loan debt. I just don't see where I see it as a kind of neoliberal delusion to think that all we need is better messaging.
I agree with
but that That just has to do with that war raging in the Democratic Party. But let's go back, because I don't want to lose the thread of this stealth campaign, the democracy in chains. So we know what's happened to the Republican Party. The Republican Party has been taken over. We know what has happened in the Democratic Party. You and I have just discussed it. Since Trump's election, someone said to me, Nancy, we were talking about Trump, and we were talking about the belief, or at least the hope that so many people had, that after Trump's presidency, we would be on some level, quote unquote, going back to normal. But it seems the new normal is so infused with the dangerous threads of this property rights absolutism that it survived the Trump presidency and has now taken a very, very dangerous turn. Now, I asked you before we came on how this new, almost civil war psychology that's going on with the alt-right today was created by this Koch brothers strategy. And what you said to me was that the Koch brothers strategy created the context. So if you could tell me your thoughts about how did we go from what you talked about in your book to things getting as dangerous as they are, not only to democracy as we know it, not only to the idea of an appropriately regulated capitalism and concern for the commons, but to what could conceivably become blood in the streets, and to some extent already has. What happened, and how do you see us getting out of this mess?
Yeah. We certainly know that Trump did a great deal of signaling to white power groups and activists with his messaging on multiple fronts. So there's that dimension. We also know that the Koch network has worked very closely with Fox News, Fox News hosts were regular speakers, have been regular speakers at the Koch network. And Fox News communication scholars have studied and shown really it's not a news service. It is an identity cultivating mechanism. And it creates an embattled identity, particularly among white Christian nationalists, and makes them feel that they are constantly under attack. So you get this fight or flight mechanism where people aren't even thinking clearly about what they need. So that disinformation is a huge piece of this, but also because of what they've done in changing the rules in the states and through gerrymandering and creating these incredibly safe Republican districts, is it's a kind of monopoly politics. The only person who will replace a Republican now is a more radical Republican. So we have a lunatic like Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina. There is Marjorie Taylor Greene. You could go, Paul Gosar. You could go on the list of these people, but they are all the fruit of this process that began with the Tea Party, as you mentioned earlier. And what scares me, though, now about this, and particularly in the wake of January 6th, is that what that made clear is that these corporate donors who are so determined to rig the future so that they can control government are now increasingly likely to realize that the alt-right kind of stormtroops can be relied upon. And they see now that the disinformation is so effective that this core of Republican voters, that 70% who believes the election was stolen from Donald Trump, they could bless a coup, right? And make sure that it succeeds. And one thing that we haven't talked about, but I think is really important for people to understand, is that the coup effort is continuing. And a number of journalists have written very well about this, like Martin Gelman. But, not only did Republican elected officials support the big lie and even vote not to certify the election, the vast majority of them, after their own offices were invaded and they had to run for safety and be protected, they came out and voted against certification of the election. So we had that. But then out in the states, they are pushing through legislation, in the states they control, to make it harder to vote and, more frighteningly, to change the way elections are run so that they can control the outcome. And that, I think, also leads us to the point that you made about violence and the potential for something like a civil war. Not like, it's not going to be the 1860s. Most of the people who specialize in modern civil wars will say, but something ugly and bloody and like nothing we've ever seen on a scale that we've seen. And that is because not one of these Republican leaders, as far as I know, has condemned the vigilantism that the party is increasingly relying on, right? So we saw
Mm-hmm.
vigilantism against COVID health measures. We've seen vigilantism. We're seeing it now, or we saw it after the election against election officials, including Republicans like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, who honestly, recognize that Biden.
Try to stand up to the
Yeah, we're
illegality.
seeing more and more threats to elected officials and to electoral staff, and now we're seeing these attacks on school boards, which are clearly a Republican strategy for 2022. And those are some of these groups like Moms for Liberty are being funded by Coat Network groups that see them, I think, as a way to win back voters that they lost over Trump by playing to most parents' deepest concern and fear, and that's for the well-being of their children. So, this is just unfolding at such a scale. And I talk to teachers, by the way, regularly, and school officials who are they're in the crosshairs of this, and they cannot believe, rightly, the legislation that's being proposed and passed in their states that would criminalize, like saying something obvious,
Oh,
like the U.S. Constitution protected slavery.
yeah. The new governor of Virginia actually has a hotline.
Right.
If your child comes home and says the teacher is teaching critical race theory, and to them, the child just learning the first slave ships were in 1619. The Civil War started in 1861. The end of slavery, the Jim Crow laws, is to them critical race theory. Just learning
Right.
American history. And like you said, it's the idea that someone has a hotline and you can turn in the
Right.
teacher. This is horrifying.
But it's
Um,
also
yeah, go
accompanying a
on.
big push to privatize public education. So the other thing we're
Yeah,
saying
yeah,
to parents is go to a Christian school where your child won't be disturbed, do
right.
homeschooling if you don't like what's being taught in the schools. But I want to say one more thing as a child who went home with such ideas from school. What these guys are afraid of is not the children feeling bad, it's the children making the parents feel bad. Because children
Yeah.
suddenly come home and they say, Mom, Dad, how come there are no African Americans in our neighborhood or Latino? Asking troubling questions, because children are moral actors, right? They're deeply ethical. They get right and wrong. They understand,
Yeah.
intuitively
Yeah.
that slavery is an awful thing. But I think they come home and they ask questions that make the parents uncomfortable. And this is something we've seen, like going back to the New Deal, when the right attacked the schools because they couldn't believe all these young people supported these changes in government. Because, and so it must be communist teachers. But no, it's children learning to be reasoning, critical.
And learning American
Yeah,
history. Well, also, something that you said I think is very important. You said the coup is
yeah,
continuing. And I have read many articles as well. People sounding the alarm, Mark Elias and others who are talking about they're planning for 2022. It's kind of like the first people who bombed the World Trade Center. It didn't go well. They just continued with their planning until in their mind they got it right. And I think people might not realize how this strategy is organized. It's to basically take the power away from the Secretary of
hmm,
State, throw it to the state legislature so that it wouldn't even matter how the people of the state voted. The people in the legislature could determine how the electors went. And if you have a state house that wants to be Trump, then it wouldn't matter, or DeSantis or whomever, it wouldn't matter who the people had voted for. Is that correct? Is that how
that
you
is
see it?
absolutely correct. And it's actually called the Independent State Legislatures Doctrine. And it's something cooked up by Federalist Society thinkers and strategists. And they have been promoting it. And it needs to be understood in the context that we were just talking about, too, where you can have, like in a state like mine, North Carolina, we have a Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, Wisconsin has.
But they've just disempowered him to such an
Exactly,
extent,
exactly.
correct?
So they're taking away power from, and they did that in
From the governor.
Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina, taking away power from governors who run statewide and presenting it to these legislative members who were elected in gerrymandered districts where they don't have to worry about any sane competition. So once you start putting the different pieces together, it's really quite chilling.
Now, I have known, as I'm sure you have known, some very wealthy,
Mhm.
civilized
Mhm.
Republicans who think that you and I are just, we're like, we just need to calm down.
Mhm.
It's never going to get that bad.
Yeah.
And some of these are very smart, very good people. What are they thinking? Are they thinking that their money would be able to buffer them from the horrors that could occur if this continues?
Yeah, I am so glad that you talk as much as you do about questions of ethics and who we are as a people and what kind of a country we should have. Because, frankly, and you and I have probably both talked to them, these Republicans who will vote for a party that is doing these horrible things to other people because it keeps their taxes low and they like that. And I think it's a point, we're at a point where we have to think about what a friend of mine calls excessive wealth disorder. That it's just
It
gotten
really is.
crazy, the gluttony, and it's like feeding other people into this diabolical machine so that what, you can have another car, you can get a vacation house. It's like, wake up, people, especially when you put climate in this, because this is the party that's stopping action on the climate. And the estimates of the climate panels are that we're going to have a minimum of 150 million climate refugees if we don't stop what we're doing
Yeah, no,
by
we could, or even
2050.
200
Like,
million.
what is going to happen? If these, so I
Well,
totally agree with you that we have to address that. I will say I've also met very good Democratic donors who are trying at the state level and nationally to do what they can and right the ship. So I think that there's,
no, that's true. Not every rich person is a greedy
yeah,
bastard. There's no doubt about that. Well, but the interesting thing is, once again, I don't know how any of them feel that their money could buffer them from what will happen if shit really hits the fan.
yeah.
But yeah,
I was
go
just
on. But I
gonna
also
say,
think your friend calling. I'm sorry, go on.
that I think there's a gender element to this too. And I was asked by this so much when I was, traveling for the book in the before times. Women would ask in the Q&A period or come up to me after, say, "How could these people imagine, that they can live through this, or don't they care about their grandchildren?" And I think,
Yeah, their kids are breathing this air.
yeah, but I think it is libertarianism is an overwhelmingly male cause. I'm going to say like 95%. It's like 98% white, 99%. And I think it's people who have always taken for granted that someone would take care of them, right? That they can rely, and so they don't even like factor this stuff in. But I do think that you're right that ultimately they think that their money will somehow protect them, or that they can get away from it. So you have someone like Peter Thiel, the hedge fund billionaire, who helped start PayPal, who was part of the Koch network and then became a big Trump supporter and now Steve Bannon supporter. He's gotten citizenship in New Zealand. So they're going to wreck this
Yeah, I
culture
saw
and
that.
go
Mm-hmm.
elsewhere. So, but
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, I do think it's unfathomable. And I think it's, again, it's a deadly dogma. Once you start down the road of the way that they think about society and about other people, you start to reach conclusions that are truly alarming to most normal
Well,
people.
also, one day I took out my calculator because I wanted to see, okay, 2% tax on 50 million and more, 1% tax on $1 billion asset. And I realized for a lot of these people, the increased tax would be little more than lunch money to them.
Yeah,
It's almost like, why should you care?
I know. I know. I know.
How does that compare to increased cancer levels because of carcinogens in the water and the air and the earth? How does that compare
I know.
to to this deadly militarism that, as JFK said, if we don't end war, war will end us?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, well,
are
one
you
thing I
hopeful?
think is that it's really important for folks on our side, the human side, to start thinking strategically as well, right? And the right has specialized in driving wedges, into the rest of the population for a long time now, over whether it's abortion or affirmative action or these various things that they like to push. But I think it's time for folks on the progressive side to start thinking, how can you break up their coalition, right? So, again, so many industries are party to at least some of these efforts through the American legislation, Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and other endeavors. And they think, oh, we're going to drive down our taxes. We won't have to worry about unions. We don't have to worry about regulations. Isn't that great? And they don't see where the train is going, right? They're not informed about the final destination. So I think, and I think that climate activists are doing some of this, but, there are whole sectors of the economy that are going to be devastated by climate change. Agriculture with drought and flooding, tourism as we lose our coastlines, insurance, so I think there's work for people of means to do in breaking up that part, like the economic part of the coalition. Then I think, with the people of faith, religious people who have gotten involved with this, they have to understand that libertarianism is at odds with the best of every major religious tradition in the world, right? Which says that we should have compassion, we should care for the sick, we should welcome the stranger, we should do, help the poor get out of poverty. All religious traditions have these elements, and they have been, their leaders, entrepreneurial leaders have, taken many of the parishioners for a ride. But I think that there are, the evangelical coalition doesn't necessarily have to be so solid. Like if we remember when Trump was separating families at the border, and even Jerry Falwell spoke out against it. Like for Jerry Falwell to have light between him and Donald Trump, there had to be a rebellion going on, in the pews of the churches. So I think that we need to be a lot more creative in, as one person who deals with the alt-right put it, creating off-ramps, right? We've got to create off-ramps for people from this.
Well, you're not going to, but what the Democrats need to understand is no point in having an off-ramp if you're not giving them an on-ramp to something better. So the Democrats need to realize you're also not giving them the on-ramp to something better. Mm-hmm. And also when you talk about, breaking them up, and first of all, there are quite a few of the younger evangelicals who are very interested in climate mm-hmm. change issues. There's a younger generation yes. of evangelicals who are absolutely interested in climate change and poverty issues. Mm-hmm. But until the Democratic Party and so many of the Democrat elites stop looking down their noses at people of faith. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How's that going to work?
And also, so people don't have homophobia at all. So that
pardon? What did you say about homophobia?
Christians are rejecting mm-hmm. the homophobia as well, and that's been an important element for this radicalized Republican Party to get people to the polls. So I think that that's important to consider too. And of course, the Koch network funds groups like they call it the Alliance Defending Freedom for it's actually global, pushing on these religious right issues. But what they mean by freedom is the freedom to discriminate and the freedom to exclude.
Of course. Yeah, that's what they call freedom, freedom. Yeah. Well, Nancy MacLean, I am so grateful to you. I thought your book was fascinating. Obviously, it's seminal. It describes what has occurred. And I also found it really fascinating talking to you about where we are and where we need to go now. And I think that our conversation, it's so interesting to me because in the last quarter or the last third of our conversation, you and I actually, just by virtue of the things we were talking about, we're delineating the break in the Democratic Party too, mm-hmm. Which is interesting. And I think the conversations between and among people like ourselves are also very, very important. Because if things continue the way they are, things might not go so well. I don't want to even give words to it, but things are not looking that good at the moment for the 2022 elections. And conversations like this will be so important for going forward. And I love the fact that we do agree on the fact that you need to, more than give people an off-ramp, you need to give them an on-ramp to something much, much better.
Yeah, such a pleasure to talk with you, and just really impressed at the voice that you're bringing to this and the way that you have been pushing on these issues. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's an honor to speak to you. I hope it's not the last time. And just know, as things continue, if you write anything, if you have anything to say, just know I'll always be out there, very, very interested, with my ears wide open. I think you're one of the most important voices in America. So thank you so very, very much.
Honored.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm sure that you understand now why I think that Nancy MacLean is such an important voice. Read Democracy in Chains. As I said to her, anything she writes, anything she has to say, I know I'm going to be listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review on Apple Podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube and join me for these continuing conversations. Remember, mariannewilliamson.substack.com. Spread the word. We need to go deep in our understanding, deep in our reflection of what has occurred and what is occurring. And out of that, we're going to create political miracles. I just know we are. See you next time.